Hello there. Welcome to section 2 of this course. Now that we have left behind the introduction phase of section 1, we are prepared to dive deeper into some of the most important concepts of Svelte: reactivity and events. That is also the name of this section and the focus for the following videos. Let's take a closer look at the concepts that we will touch in this section. In this section, we will take a closer look at dynamic attributes, one of the most useful features of Svelte. We will continue with 2 videos about DOM events and events in general, also very important when building reactive applications. Then, we will proceed to learn about two-way bindings. In the final video of this section, we will see how Svelte implements conditional CSS classes. Now that we know a little bit more about this section, let's see what this first video is about. As I just mentioned, the main goal of this video is to introduce the concept of dynamic attributes in Svelte, what they are and how to use them. After learning the basics, we will put our knowledge into practice and add some dynamic attributes to our current project. All set? Let's start section 2. Before explaining the concept of dynamic attributes, I would first like to address the concept of reactivity. Why is it important to aim for reactive applications? Reactivity helps us keep the DOM and the state of our application synchronized. In other words, it ensures that the relation between what the user sees and how our application behaves is kept updated. A reactive application will always feel better to use than a non-reactive one. Many bugs and misbehaviors can be avoided if our state and the DOM are synchronized with each other. Fortunately for us, this is one of the main strengths of Svelte. It keeps the DOM updated without us having to worry too much about it. It packs a lot of features that work towards this goal, and it does so in a very straightforward way, without complex syntax or constructs. One of the more useful features for a reactive DOM are the focus of this video: dynamic attributes. Now, we already had a brief glimpse at dynamic attributes at the end of last section, but we should ask ourselves formally, what are actually dynamic attributes? You can think of them as HTML attributes that can change dynamically, depending on the logic of our application. They are similar to the regular HTML attributes that you already know. Think, for example, of the href attribute of an anchor tag or the disabled attribute of a button tag. These are standard attributes for standard HTML tags. Dynamic attributes have a small difference though. With the use of JavaScript, we can add logic and programming to the values of these tags. This lets us change these values dynamically according to our JavaScript code. This JavaScript code can be a variable, a reference to a JavaScript function, or even a whole JavaScript expression. It's up to us to define this behavior in the way that we see fit. Using this feature is very easy in Svelte. We only have to enclose our code between brackets and make sure that this is valid JavaScript code. That's how easy it is. The good news is that we can use these dynamic expressions in other parts of our code. We can use it also with the component props that we saw at the end of the previous section. Take, for example, the 4th bullet point of this list. We could have a dynamic prop where the value of the prop title is the concatenation of the string my and the value of the property name of the application object. We can also use this feature within the plain text of the HTML document. We already have seen this in action when we created the navbar component at the end of last section. It is also worth mentioning that if the name of the attribute and its value match, we can add a shorthand method to make things shorter. Take, for example, the last point. If we are assigning the HTML attribute ID to a JavaScript variable named ID, we can simply write ID between brackets, making our code look cleaner. After seeing how many things dynamic attributes can do, you surely now can see how useful they are. Let's start using them ourselves in our project. Okay, so now I'm back in VS Code. I am running my development server on my local host, and I am ready to start coding. Let's check a couple of examples of dynamic attributes and reactivity in Svelte. So first of all, let's check dynamic plain text. We already had a hint or a first taste of this in our previous section, if you remember the navbar component that we created. If I open the navbar component, you may remember that we used here dynamically the prop called title. So title here is enclosed between brackets, so it's reactive. And as you may remember, title is the prop of this component. When this component is used by its parent, we can give a value or pass a value from parent to child with this prop component. In our case, our parent component was app.svelte. If you may remember, we gave title a value of the string vcard generator. So for example, if I change this back to, for example, vcard, let's save and switch to the browser and see how that changed. You can see in the browser that the navbar now is called simply vcard. Let's go back to VS Code and revert those changes, save, and go back to the browser. You can see that now the navbar is called vcard generator again. So this is another example of plain text, or an example that we already had. Now that we know plain text, let's check out dynamic attributes of HTML markup or HTML DOM elements. So let's go back to VS Code. So now in VS Code, we can create, for example, a button. Let's create a button and give it the text of reset, for example. Now, as you may know, buttons have a property called disabled, which is already here. Disable is a Boolean property. If it's true, the button is disabled. If it's false, the button is enabled or not disabled. By default, as you may expect, is enabled or disabled equals false, right? I can also declare it like this, and the button will be disabled. This is valid HTML markup. So if we save and go back to the browser, you can see that here we have the button that we just created. As we expected, it is disabled. Now back in VS Code, let's think how we can make this property dynamic. We already learned this, so let's add a little bit of code for that. First of all, let's create a variable. We can name it, for example, button or btn disabled, and give it a default value of false, for example. Now, as we already learned, to make this attribute dynamic, we simply have to say equals, brackets, and the name of the variable, which in our case is btn disabled. So if we save this and go back to the browser, we can see now that the button is enabled. That's because the disabled variable had the value of false. So now I can click, use the button. Of course, it's not linked to anything, so it's not doing anything right now. But now the button is enabled. That's the important part. If I go back to VS Code and I set this variable to true and I save, let's go back to the browser, you can see that now, as expected, the button is disabled. You can see how we can dynamically set the value of this attribute according to how we set the variable that is linked to it. As you may imagine, this can be really handy in some situations, as we can change programmatically the value of this variable and then change, therefore, the attributes of this HTML or DOM node. So now that we have seen that back in VS Code, let's talk about the last part of our video, which was using the shorthand method. As you may remember, if the attribute's name matches the one of the variable, then we can use the shorthand method, and this makes our code a little bit more compact. So if our variable would also be called disabled, we could use this shorthand method. So let's try that out. Let's simply rename this, and of course where it's used. And now we could have remove this, and it would be the same. I can also save, and my code formatter will do that automatically for me, and for you if you also have it, of course. So this will be the same as saying disabled equals brackets disabled. So now we've saved that. Let's check it out in the browser. Everything is the same as we expected. Nothing changed. The button is still disabled. So let's go back to VS Code and set the disabled variable to false. Save. Go back to the browser. And you can see, of course, as well as we expected, the button is now enabled. So the shorthand method works as we expected, of course. Okay, now we know about dynamic attributes in Svelte. As you could see, this feature is very powerful and easy to learn. We will be using dynamic attributes and text throughout the course, so you will see more of them in the future.